I want to set the scene for the roundtable. I'll be sharing what we learned from the last project with the idea that it will inform what we're going to do in the current, because this project is about embedding and extending the lessons from the last project. When I just spoke to Claire a minute ago, I was really pleased when you said it's just great to see work that's building. There's some continuity of the work, and we feel that too. We're not just getting one project doing something, it's gone, nothing happens with it. So we feel very excited that the OLT thought that the work was worth continuing and extending. So that's what I'm going to do, set the scene. Okay, so I wanted to start with a wonderful definition of academic integrity. Tricia and I are both part of the ICAI, the International Centre for Academic Integrity. I think there are other universities here who are also institutional members. When I first started doing my research about 12 years ago, I saw this definition from the Fundamental Values Project. And I was like, oh, that looks so simple, you know? Oh, I could come up with something like that. Well, having done the work now for a number of years, I know actually how difficult it is to distill the key ideas behind a concept. So I wanted to start with this so that at least we have some shared understanding about when I'm talking about academic integrity and when we're all talking about it. This is really where we're starting from. So academic integrity is a commitment, even in the face of adversity, to the 5 fundamental values: honesty, trust, fairness, respect, and responsibility. And from these values flow principles of behaviour that enable academic communities to translate ideals into action. For me, this is about values, it's about principles, it's about us and what we do as a community and action. And as I continue to show what we've learned from our last project, you'll see that this definition actually was borne out by our research as well. So I think it's a fabulous one to start with. So, you know, what are we embedding and extending? We're going to be looking at the findings and the recommendations from our OLT-funded project, the 5 core elements of exemplary academic integrity policy. Sadia sent you our paper and she sent you a little framework for the way you're going to be presenting your practice. It's not gospel. It's not the only way we could present it. It's a nice, simple framework to use. And no doubt, as you go forward in the work you do, you will expand on that and change it and develop it further. Having shared that, we want to talk about how we can adapt best practices for identified student groups, and I'll tell you why we've identified these groups. The 3 groups are International English as an Additional Language, EAL students. Everyone in this room knows for 20 years we've been talking about how we need to support EAL students. We keep talking about it. We'd really like to develop some useful resources for that group of students. A group of students we're calling educationally less prepared, and I'll explain how we came to that term later in the presentation, but essentially it's a group of students we're concerned about who are slipping through the system, who are coming in perhaps from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether it's educationally, socio-economic, culturally, but for whatever reason, and it's difficult to determine, they're finding it hard to understand even the most simple concepts, something like integrity. So we're calling that group educationally less prepared. And our research also identified that a higher degree by research students require additional support and training in the area of academic integrity. So what did we do in the last project? We analysed the Australian academic integrity policies, the available ones online, publicly available. We did a very large student survey. We interviewed senior managers and we ran focus groups of students and staff. And the whole point about our project, everything we aimed to do, was to foster a culture of integrity across the sector. Look, I don't know if we succeeded in doing that. It has been encouraging for Sadia and I, because we've been doing some analysis of policy recently and going back to those 39 policies, and already we can see a shift. Now, I'd love to say that's because of what we did. Maybe no. But we can see a shift, and we can see a shift occurring in the way people view integrity, the way they respond to it, about the way their policies are enacted. So if we're a tiny part of that, we'll feel we've succeeded. So our policy analysis we looked at the way policies have changed, and what we found is that there was a change from a focus. In the past, there was very much a focus on misconduct. In the policies in 2010, when we were doing the analysis, it still was misconduct, but only 51%, so just over half. There was a change to integrity and education. 41% of our policies were coded in that way. And intriguingly, 28% of policies had a mixed focus. So they were both educative and punitive, if that's possible. So, and I think this is a result of the sector changing its focus. A lot of universities have realised they need to revisit their policies, so they might, for example, rename their policy, which used to be called academic misconduct policy, or policy to punish students who have done bad. They might rename that and call it an academic integrity policy, but then the guts of the policy is not fundamentally changed. It's still got a bit of a punitive policy. Or alternatively, they may have left the title as academic misconduct policy, but throughout, when you read it, it really was taking an educative approach. So 28%, and I think that's the interesting bit, had a mixed focus. 10% of policies were concerned with risk management, and that also is borne out by other research we've done. For the sceptics in us, we might have thought a lot more universities were thinking, oh, it's all about risk and management for the reputation of the university. In fact, it wasn't a big focus. Only 10% had that even mentioned in their policy. Students were still considered to be primarily the ones responsible for AI. The institution was mentioned only in 39% of policies. We maintain that it is a multi-stakeholder responsibility. We can't put all the responsibility for maintaining integrity on our students. The institution has to take responsibility, teaching staff, administrative staff, and everyone in between. Most policies, over half, lack sufficient detail about breaches and outcomes, so you can imagine how that causes students to have anxiety. You're accused of a breach, you can't actually work out what that breach really is or what it means, and then if you can't work that out, you can't work out what the outcome might be. So academic integrity investigations continue to be very stressful because of that lack of clarity. And interesting from our point of view, about the same number, over half, lacked any reference to confidentiality. And again, our team maintain that if students and staff are not sure about confidentiality, they're less likely to want to report and follow up on a potential breach if they're concerned that students might be in some way victimised. The 5 core elements of exemplary policy, Sadia sent that to you. I know you've worked out your presentations based on this. Our colleague Margaret Wallace in our team came up with this lovely way of representing our ideas. We wanted to show something which wasn't in order. There's no one element here that is more important than another. This is a Solomon seal knot, and when a knot's pulled together, the whole thing is so much tighter and stronger. So each one of those strands connects to each other, is in fact part of the one strand. So no element privileged over another, they're all interconnected. It's strong when it comes together, but the point about it is it doesn't matter if you have all of those 5 elements, you can have them on paper, but if you don't have at the centre of your university policy and framework and culture a commitment to fostering and inculcating academic integrity, those 5 elements will mean nothing. Which is very much what we had gone and looked at policies, and we'd identified 5 universities, they're all in the room today, that had really good academic integrity policies that were available online. We don't know what that means in practice though, and that's really why we've got you in the room to tell us what that means. So in brief, and I know you've got this in your mind, so I'm really just reiterating this so that we're all on the same page today. Accessibility is about if the policy is easy to locate, if it's easy to read, if it's concise and comprehensible. There's no point having a policy which is difficult to find. If you've got to do multiple searches, doesn't matter how great your policy is if you can't find it. If we couldn't find it, we figured it would be hard for undergrad students. The approach, we believe it should be an aspirational statement of purpose with an educative focus up front and all through the policy. So it's not enough just to say, you know, we believe that integrity has all these values, etc., and then the rest of your policy has a punitive approach. So a consistent approach that's aspirational, and we believe that values are important. Responsibility, as I mentioned, we maintain that the responsibility for academic integrity is for all stakeholders, not just students. I mentioned before that 56% didn't have adequate detail about breaches and outcomes. We think that that's important. You need to have extensive but not excessive description of breaches and outcomes and the processes that you go through in an investigation. So we did see some policies that, yes, they had detail, but they had way too much, which then affected their accessibility issue. If you download a policy and it looks like a Bible, you're unlikely to be able to access that and understand that either. And finally, but not last, because it isn't a hierarchical structure, we maintain that proactive and embedded systems to enable implementation of the policy for both students and staff are absolutely vital to the other 4 elements. And that means academic integrity training, modules, online training, information in course books, reiteration of the importance of integrity at every level of your degree, right through to HDR students, postgraduate research students. Support professional development for staff who are investigating breaches, but also for staff who are teaching, so they understand how the policy works as well. So they're the 5 core elements, and we'll be using that as our framework to discuss your various policies today. Okay, we did a student survey following the analysis of the policy. It was actually the largest survey ever done on this topic in Australia, bizarrely. We didn't know that was going to happen. We actually had 15,304 students respond to our survey. It's quite different to other student surveys around Australia. Other surveys have tended to want to ask students about why they cheat, what the factors are. They want people to self-report about their cheating behaviour. We weren't interested. We know that some students cheat, a small percentage of students. The numbers vary, but 5 to 8% of students will cheat. 5 to 8% of the general population will probably cheat. We weren't interested in doing another survey which told us that. What we wanted to do was find out what students understood about academic integrity and how they'd like to be educated about it. So that was the focus of this survey. So in brief, some highlights from that survey, and a couple of people in the room have heard this before. Around 2/3 of students said they'd heard of academic integrity and they thought they had a good idea what it entails. So around 2/3. There's this little group here, 4.4% of the total students, and that number doubled for international students, said they'd never heard of academic integrity and they couldn't work it out. They couldn't work out what it would mean. And that's the group we're calling educationally less prepared. We don't know what the factors are there. We just can't. They don't get it. We want to try and find out why they don't. Again, around 2/3 said they knew their university had a policy and they knew how to access it. About 80% of the total students agreed that the policy was clearly communicated, but that number went down for postgraduates to just over 70% for HDR students. I've highlighted these two numbers. So 2/3 of students said they'd heard of integrity, they had a pretty good idea what it was, but that number jumped up to 94%, and a little bit less for international students, said they felt confident they knew how to avoid a breach. So on the one hand, only 2/3 know about it, but just about everybody can avoid a breach. So that disparity is something to look at. Why do students feel so confident when they don't all say they know what it is? And this was a great one for us. We were excited by this finding. 92% of the total students, and that number went up to nearly 96% of our higher degree by research students, said that they thought academic integrity had relevance to their life beyond the university, their professional and personal lives. And I think that counters a lot of the intuitive knowledge people have. They were like, oh, this is just, academic integrity is just something you do in the university. Out there in the real world, well, this is my real world. I don't know about anybody else, it's a student's real world. Actually, they think it matters. It's not just something they need to learn about in terms of how to write an essay. And I think we can get caught very much on talking about integrity as if it's the practices, how to put a comma and a full stop and a bracket in your referencing, when it's so much more than that, which is why I've started our presentation with values. It is about that, it is about academic practices, but that's just one part of it. So yeah, that was an encouraging finding. So, most people had a good understanding. Disproportionate felt confident about avoiding a breach. Our international students, not surprisingly, expressed a much lower confidence about AI generally and how to avoid a breach. Our postgraduate research students were the least satisfied with the information and support they received. And we had this small group that we've identified and called educationally less prepared. So it's those groups of students that we really want to focus on today and tomorrow. That's why we've got you all in the room to share how you enact your policy, with the idea that tomorrow we'll say, okay, these universities are doing a fabulous job, or I'm sure you'll identify some challenges too. You don't have to feel you have to say it's all fantastic. But tomorrow, what can we do to actually apply those lessons to those 3 identified student groups? In our interviews with senior managers, we asked just one question. There are many other questions we asked, but the one I'm going to report today, this question is, what is your understanding of academic integrity? And it was actually very difficult to get our respondents to focus on positives. Mostly people wanted to talk immediately about misconduct. They wanted to talk about plagiarism and cheating. And we had to say, no, can you tell us about integrity? And it took a lot to get people back. And this was sort of the response that we pretty much got a lot of the time. The only time anyone's really thinking about notions of academic integrity is when they're reducing it simply to academic misconduct and pinging someone for plagiarism. So we were wanting to get people to think about integrity beyond the misconduct. And that was a challenge. Looking at our 28 interviews, we coded them and came up with a very simple way of trying to understand what people thought about academic integrity. And what we thought we could say is that, based on this pie chart you can see, that academic integrity is grounded in action. So it's about academic practices, and that can be, referencing scholarly practices, publishing, researching. It's not just students referencing. So it's grounded in action, underpinned by values. So values, I think, tends to be at the foreground in the US context. It's still very important in the Australian context, but it comes after practices. It's what we do, and that's underpinned by values. Keep going back to that original definition. It is multifaceted and applicable to multiple stakeholders. Everybody who we interviewed talked about that. They actually recognised it wasn't just a student issue. It's understood by many in terms of what it's not, misconduct. And going back to that, the whole risk management thing, you can see here that 8% of our respondents talked about risk management. They talked about the quality and credibility of educational process, and that goes back to that policy analysis where 10%, so it's about the same, talked about risk. Now, I want to read this out in full. It's a bit long. I'll read it with you. I think this is a fantastic definition of academic integrity. This is a sort of preamble, the sort of approach we think would sit very well at the beginning of a policy. So, academic integrity encompasses a number of values and ideals that should be upheld in an academic institution. Within the academy, there's a fundamental obligation to exercise integrity, which includes honesty, trustworthiness and respect. Within an academic structure, those values must be evident in the research as well as the teaching and learning activities of the institution. And you can see the colour coding from the way we looked at it. Academic integrity involves ensuring that in research and in teaching and learning, both staff and students act in an honest way, that they're open and accountable for their actions, and that they exhibit fairness and transparency when they're dealing with people or with research. I actually really loved that very much too, because it wasn't just talking about what we do with text. Furthermore, it's important that staff members at all levels be role models and demonstrate integrity as an example to students who progress through the education system, then transition into professional life. That goes back to what our students told us. It does matter. It's not just something that happens in the university. Academic integrity impacts on students and staff in these core activities and is fundamental to the reputation and standing of an organisation and its members. I just love that. I think they might have done a bit of research before we interviewed them, so I reckon they went to the ICAI Fundamental Values Project and got those values sorted. But it does, it's a long one. The point is you can't just do an academic integrity is blur. It is so nuanced, it is so complex, it requires really thinking it through, and I do love that excerpt. It's on our website, very happy if people want to use it, adapt it. With acknowledgement. So what is the connection between all this stuff, values and understandings and elements of policy? And most importantly, what actually happens in practice, which is why we're here now. Last year I was at the Plagiarism Conference in the UK, and I was trying to conceptualise this, and I came up with an iceberg representation. And here it is, and I'll be brief, it's on the site. But, with apologies to Freud, we're talking about, the unconscious. Those values are actually deeply held, and they're hard to change. They take a long time. It's very difficult to get to those and difficult to get people to even articulate them. Understanding sits just below the surface, and that also takes a bit of unpacking, which is what we tried to do in our interviews. What we can see here above the water, very transparent, is those publicly available policies. They are right, the public face of the university. So we can see those, we can analyse those. And then really we want to say, which is what we're doing here today, what actually happens in practice. So from our perspective, our project's been looking at all of those and how they come together. So the aims of our project. We want to extend and embed the 5 core elements of exemplary policy across the sector. We want to develop resources, tangible resources that are accessible to both public and private universities and higher education providers. We want to develop support systems for EAL students. We know that those students need that. We also want to do the same for educationally less prepared students. And we want to extend the lessons about policy and support to higher degree by research students. Again, those 3 identified student groups. That's what we want to do in this current project with a very big kickstart here at the Roundtable. So where are we up to? I've gone from thinking of an iceberg to thinking of a tree, as you can see by our logo. And you can see that you'll see that there's 5 roots and there's 5 branches. We're looking at the 5 values that underpin everything we do and go deep, deep into the ground. The branches, which are the policy, which are the understandings, which are what happens in practice, and it reaches out and has repercussions for the whole sector. So that's why we have the tree as our emblem for this project. Well, where are we up to? Sadia and I, especially Sadia, has been working very hard at analysing high degree by research academic integrity policy, and we're going to share the preliminary findings from that with you today. We aim to engage all higher education providers, so not just universities, but all private and public providers, and Lee Poynton is going to share some of the context and her experience from QIBT with us today. The Roundtable, we're going to actually ask each other and share with each other what actually happens in practice in our context. I would encourage you, I know we're going to be videoing, it's going to be on our site, I would encourage you, please don't feel you have to sell it as perfect and beautiful and without issue. Already we know your policy is good, but if we sell it as something so perfect, it's very hard for other universities to ever embrace it. They'll be just like, oh, we can't get there. So I do encourage you to share some of the challenges you have as well so that we can go forward. We have the National Speaking Tour, which I've mentioned, and that's the next week and a half of crazy travel. And we're developing an online academic integrity policy tool, and over these 2 days we're going to find some space in our agenda for Karen to share some of her preliminary thinking about how we're going to develop that tool. So the aims of this roundtable: develop an understanding of changing higher education context, and David's going to speak in a moment and help us with that. Showcase some practical implementation details, use the 5 core elements as our framework. Everything's going to be videotaped and transcribed, and we're going to be sharing that with the idea of adapting it for those 3 identified student groups. We've got some references here, happy for you to access the site. I do encourage you to go to the Academic Integrity Standards Project as well. We've got lots of learning resources on there. Again, we'll probably take you through that. I think Sadia is going to show you some of those over the course of the 2 days too. Everything, all the PowerPoints from today and tomorrow and notes and so on will be on our website next week. The videos will be available in about 2 weeks. Okay, so thank you very much.